Good afternoon. We've decided to make a video cycle of lectures or seminars on the themes and the meaning of our life. Initially, it was supposed that these would be lectures on the course Fundamentals of Sociology. Here are 3 volumes. Practice shows that the same word order, if it is written and read, then man's psyche works in one mode, extracting meaning from it. And if one just reads it out loud, then this will be far from the best performance. If we talk about oratory, since man's psyche also perceives the meaning from oral speech somewhat differently than from text. Moreover, the first volume was written several years ago, and it is connected with the historical and political context that was. And now it is a somewhat different time, and therefore it is better to present the same questions in a slightly different way. The conversation will be about life, about the meaning of life, and about how and what should be done in order for all of us to live better. Let us start with these simple things that do not require any proof, by strength of their indisputable evidence. And if someone does not agree, it is only because he turns a blind eye to those things and does not want to see them. We live in a civilization in which we are dependent on the technosphere. If any of us is released into the natural environment without any attributes of a technospheric character, but simply in natural form, wherever it happens, in the tropics, subtropics, beyond the Arctic Circle, in winter or summer, the question will be closed in a very short time. If we talk about the technosphere is now being reproduced on the basis of collective labor activity, in which what is commonly called professionalism of specialists is dominant. And we live on the basis of collective labor. What does this practically mean? There is such a task. For some reason, it causes great difficulties when you put it to students, who even seem to have received credits or passed exams in the course Probability Theory and Mathematical Statistics. A Kamaz truck comes with bricks. 10 men line up in a chain and begin throwing bricks to each other, and thus unload the truck. The probability that each of them will catch a brick, will not drop a brick, is 0.9. The question is, how many bricks will remain? 0.9 to the 10th power of a brick will survive. This is slightly more than 1/3 of what came. Approximately 2/3 of the cargo will be broken. And if there were exactly as many bricks in the truck as it takes to build something, and the men successfully broke the whole thing, then the project will be thwarted. Next task. 10,000 men gathered and decided to make an Airbus from scratch. The attitude to labor is the same. What will happen? Usually, students say that they do not want to be passengers of this Airbus. I usually reassure them, saying that they should not worry, this will not come to that. The first model of the Airbus is unlikely to be rolled out of the assembly shop. If we turn from this task to life, then we live with approximately such an attitude towards labor that any product of collective activity contains mind somewhere. Some flaws that the end user, one way or another, must take as a given, or make additional efforts to eliminate all this. Moreover, we are not talking about direct sabotage with malicious intent, or just something for fun. The point is that people allegedly perform their official duties professionally. If labor is of a collective character, then, according to its quality, it splits into two fundamentally different varieties. There is governerial labor, the content of which is to set tasks for subordinates, organize them to perform these tasks, and control the results. And there is labor, partly governerial, because one way or another, everything has to be governed. But by its nature, it is anyway productive labor for the most part. When, within the framework of a project, a comrade must take something from someone, then to perform technological operations with this, and pass the product of his activity to someone else, in order for him to continue and integrate this fragment of collective labor into a certain common product. If we talk about governerial labor, then society always has tasks that require professional governerial labor. And as a consequence of the fact that these tasks exist, civilization at a certain stage of development gives rise to statehood. Further on, statehood is understood as the subculture of governance towards affairs of social as a whole significance at the local level and on the scale of the whole society on a professional basis. The reality is such that the statehood, being engaged in those affairs that people, acting in their individual capacity, or on the basis of episodic self-organization of initiators, cannot solve these problems either at all or with the desired level of quality. And again, if you look at how modern civilization lives, it turns out that if statehood does not cope with its responsibilities, which I have mentioned, then the errors of statehood and the abuse of power that it allows, alone and on the basis of self-organization, no one can compensate. The reasons are simple. We live on the basis of collective labor, and the quality of governance of this collective labor depends on the character of the work of the statehood and on the quality of the work of the statehood. It creates certain conditions, interacting with which every one of us, within the boundaries of his own professionalism, can ensure the quality of his life. If the statehood does not cope with its duties, then, no matter how high professionalism may be, it can be devalued.
Но это даже не вопрос, это насколько я вас верно понимаю. Если мы возьмем пример предыдущий с мужиками, которые строили самолет, да, и переведем его на управление государственностью, если государственный чиновник делает свои дела там, с коэффициентом 0,9, то когда много чиновников, все государство по сути работает достаточно плохо, потому что вот эта ошибка, она накапливается в цепочках управления. Это так?
This is partly true, because the work of the state apparatus is of a two-leveled character. Firstly, statehood does not work just like that. Statehood works for a quite determined conception of organization of the life of society in the continuity of generations. And the poor quality of life can be programmed by the conception itself. In other words, if the conception is bad and the statehood works well, then the quality of life will leave much to be desired. But even if the conception is good and the statehood, for various reasons, works poorly, the quality of life will also leave much to be desired. Therefore, one cannot say here that it all comes down to officials, to their dishonesty. It doesn't just come down to this. Since 2013, we have been observing events in Ukraine. The essence of the events: the president is not coping with his duties, someone cannot wait, someone starts to protest, someone starts to finance protest moods, and those who protest, they hope that when the incumbent president is ousted, removed from power, then everything will be fine. Because new people will come, new people in general, who have had nothing to do with the previous statehood, i.e., the Maidan will nominate its leaders and they will restore order. There is a story by Prosper Merimi called Tamango. The essence is as follows. In Africa, there lived one leader who was engaged in selling his fellow tribesmen. Once he overlooked, as a result of which he himself turned out to be a part of the cargo of the slaves, which was transported from Africa to America by ship. The prospects did not suit him, so a riot was organized. The entire crew was thrown overboard, and they found themselves alone with the sea element and the ship. Then it turned out that in order to steer the ship, they needed to have some knowledge. Moreover, not just the knowledge that there is a jib, but also the knowledge of the order in which the different ropes had to be pulled in order for the ship to sail in good weather along the appropriate course, and what had to be done when the weather changed, and they would have to change the course. That is, knowledge was needed, and the whole thing ended with the fact that everyone died of hunger. When an English frigate found them, Tamango was the only one alive. Well, in the end, he was taken to America, where he lost himself in drink. This is one of the sails on the ship. But what is the use if we, for example, know what it is? If we don't know how to find a place, in reality, having found ourselves on a sailing ship, what to do with it?
То есть ты можешь уметь поворачивать паруса, но все равно корабль неизвестно куда направить этим поворотом.
That is, there is also certain well-coordinated work in governance towards the ship. If we recall the times of the sailing navy, then the crew of 120 cannon ship of the line is about 700 people, every one of whom must do his job on time. Otherwise, he can break the masts and tear the sails, or the ship will perish. So the state is often likened to a ship. Those who protested on the Maidan did not at all think about what knowledge is necessary in order for the Maidan to nominate capable leaders so that they could ensure universal prosperity and well-being in Ukraine. And now the situation in Ukraine is developing in the context of the story Tamango by Prosper Mérimée. Well, what about us?
Примерно так же.
In general, almost the same, but somewhat better. Why better? Because what is the difference between Russia and Ukraine? The first Ukrainian statehood is Radianska Ukraine, which was factually created by Comrade Stalin.
А как же Киевская Русь?
Kievan Rus has nothing to do with Ukrainian statehood, because the entire Bellinic cycle was recorded in the Russian north. Kabzari did not sing about Vladimir the Great. The reason is simple. When there were events in the traditional chronology attributed to 1238, called the Batu invasion, and after Kiev was taken, on the territory of modern Ukraine, for about a century, it was impossible to live. And all who survived, they moved from there to those places where the evil Tatars could not get them. They could not get to the north of Novgorod-Pskov land. And there they preserved, in the form of an epic, the memory of the era of the Kiev princes. And all the Belinas of the Kiev cycle were recorded in the 19th century, precisely there.
Как раз вот вопрос о монголо-татар. Многие полагают этого, что вообще не было, это были междоусобные войны. То есть в этом ключе, как понимать. Или просто нашествие кочевников имеется в виду.
Interpretation of what happened is another theme. There are different opinions on this, but the reality is such that the burial grounds of that era actually speak of genocide, or punitive operations that turned into genocide. Who did it? The question is open, because in one version, this is the struggle of the Great Tartary against separatism. In another version, it is the invasion of those descended from Genghis Khan. Let's get back to our theme. What is our theme?
Государственность, мы говорили о...
Our statehood. We had statehood at least since the time of Rurik. This tradition of statehood is, in a way, imprinted in the spirit of the people. But Ukraine is faced with the need to create statehood from scratch. And so far, there are no ideas there that would allow creating this stable functioning statehood, which would be supported by the entire population of the country. If we talk about our statehood, let's draw parallels with Japan. In 1861, we had the abolition of serfdom. Japan, 1868, the liquidation of the shoguns, and the restoration of what, from the point of view of the Japanese, is called correct imperial ruling. Agree, the starting conditions are about the same. In the 70s of the last century, Japan factually liquidated the strata class system, because it was announced that all subjects were equal before the reigning dynasty. That is, there is a reigning dynasty, it stands alone, it performs certain functions, but all subjects are equal. Accordingly, the son of a peasant can graduate from military school and become an officer. The Russian Empire, until 1917, in fact somewhat earlier, until 1914, the strata class system is maintained. Into a number of higher educational institutions, only a noble son can enter, and in some cases, not just a noble offspring, but of certain families, because the poor nobility are not able to pay for their studies there. Further, by 1904, the Russo-Japanese War, all the rank and file of the Japanese Imperial Navy can read and write. Moreover, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that for this, they had to learn not 33 letters of the alphabet, but a little more symbols. By 1917, 85% of the population cannot read or write. If we talk about the reasons for the collapse of the Russian Empire, then the reason is simple. The strata caste system cannot nominate from its midst the governorial corps of the necessary number which would ensure the quality of governance, which would give Russia the opportunity to implement the scenario that Japan had successfully implemented. 1991, again the catastrophe of statehood. Now many are nostalgic for Soviet times, but nonetheless, if we go back to 1991, then it turns out that practically everything that was mass-produced in the Soviet Union, starting with a 3-kopeck office binder and ending with the world's largest submarine, Akula, about which many are nostalgic, was unacceptably bad in comparison with American analogies. And those who cry about the fact that the Akula was cut and went into scrap metal, they should know that at the end of the 80s, in the American naval press, the following question was discussed. What to do with Soviet submarines in the period of threats? And American military analysts reduced this whole discussion to the thought, what to do? Sink them. Why could they afford such an answer? Because they were convinced of impunity, that with 30 decibels of the advantage in noise over Soviet submarines, they knew where any of the Soviet submarines was located and were able to guaranteedly destroy all of them, thereby completely eliminating the possibility of a retaliatory strike. The question arises, when it ceased to be a secret, how did the leadership react? The answer is simple. The top leadership tried to hush up the scandal. And those who initiated the question that Soviet submarines were inferior in noise to American ones, all of them were more or less quickly kicked out of the profession so that they would not get underfoot and would not interfere with covering up gaps. If we talk about the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union, then again, the governance was not adequate to the circumstances. We survived our Maidan in 1991. Party let us steer, the slogan of that era. The party let them steer. What happened?
Развал страны.
The result was the collapse of the country, and only thanks to the fact that in the people's spirit, whichever quality of the culture of state governance was inscribed, the collapse of the RSFSR, or the Russian Federation, remained in the plans of those who wanted it. And then, since 2000, thanks to the efforts of Vladimir Vladimirovich, the functionality of those state structures that arose after 1991 was restored. Then again the question arises, is the quality of governance, the quality of the life of society, which they provide, is it sufficient? Does it satisfy us or not? And in fact, the reality is such that at best, 5% of the population who live in villas and drive Rolls-Royces and other expensive foreign cars are satisfied with everything. They actually live behind the fence of special settlements and have nothing to do with the life of the people. Then the question arises about the prospects, primarily their prospects. The reality is such that for the most part, they are not able to give the correct upbringing and education to their offspring, and their children and grandchildren enter the path of degradation. And then there is one characteristic feature of our history. Since the days after Rurik, we have actually had a tribal system. What does this mean? This means that if a person belongs to a certain clan by his biological origin, or he is adopted by a certain clan, then he has the right to occupy certain positions in the state apparatus, regardless of whether he has knowledge and skills, in order to perform official duties related to the position he holds. The following people fought against this at different times: Ivan the Terrible, Peter I, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, and they all have a reputation as tyrants and despots. But if you look at our history, then we reproduce the tribal system, regardless of how our statehood is organized. Be it specific principalities, when princes butt heads over who is in charge, be it the Kingdom of Moscow, be it the Russian Empire, the great and mighty Soviet Union, or post-Soviet democracy. Anyway, in reality, we have a tribal system. And the tribal system, by virtue of the characteristic feature that I have mentioned, does not provide a quality of governance that allows society to respond to the challenges of the time and solve problems inherited from the past without creating new problems.
Но тот же самый родоплеменной строй существует в США, например, тот же самый клан Бушей, да, вот эти американские управленческие, клан Кеннеди, например, ну, которому досталось, но тем не менее, да, Байдены, потом кланы, уже набившие оскомину, но тем не менее финансовые, Ротшильды, Рокфеллеры, Барухи, ну и так далее. Они, у них же тоже родоплеменной строй.
And Condoleezza Rice, where is this from?
Не, но это уже другие.
This is not different.
Но это уровнем ниже.
This is not a lower level. These are governors who really govern. Because in the United States, power is built on a somewhat different principle. There are orderers of governors, and there are practical governors. The orderers of governance are, in fact, a clan system. They do not make the weather with their personalities in the USA cadre corps of governance. Practical governors are completely different clans. And only a few of them, having passed through the political sphere, join the clans of the orderers of governance, such as the Kennedy clan. Because the reality is such. What is the money made on?
На нефти, например.
First, money was made on the prohibition of alcoholic beverages. That is, completely criminal money. Then, the legalization of capital, entering politics, abiding in power in the continuity of several generations. And only this gives reason to already belong to this very American aristocracy. But if we talk about what is happening there, then McCain, the known to everyone senator, is also an example of the fact that the tribal system is dangerous for the United States as well. Because there are two stories connected with McCain that are not talked about much. To be precise, they don't go into details about these stories. The first story, a fire on the aircraft carrier Forrestal, as a result of which several dozen aircraft burned down, more than 100 people were killed, and the aircraft carrier from the Vietnam region had come for repairs to the US, where it was under repair for more than 6 months. The missile that became the source of the fire was launched from the fighter, in the cockpit of which sat McCain. And the only question is, did he himself press the wrong buttons, or was there some technical glitch, but he was just there?
Ну, надо сказать, что системы огня на самолетах, они дублируются. Ну, то есть там несколько переключателей надо нажать, чтобы спустить.
But nevertheless, the missile was launched from the fighter in which McCain was sitting. And the second story. This is an episode connected with the fact that he ejected and fell into a lake in the middle of Hanoi, from where he was taken out. Now he has a lot of claims about the absence of humanism among the Vietnamese, that in captivity he was mistreated. But you see, not everyone has strong nerves, especially after what the Americans did there. Because when the carpet bombing of Vietnam began with the B-52, the American pilots had no concept of humanism. The humanism of the American pilots began to appear only when quite normal air defense missiles appeared in Vietnam, and the losses of the B-52 became tangible. That's when it started. The American pilots began to write en masse reports on the theme that bombing Vietnamese villages from the B-52 was not humane. And few people know how American aviation reacted to the sending of Soviet troops into Afghanistan. The sending of Soviet troops into Afghanistan took place on New Year's Eve of 1980. I'm not condoning the sending, I'm only talking about how the American aviation reacted. In January 1980, there was an unmotivated 2-week spike in accidents in American aviation. Within those 2 weeks, they damaged the same number of planes as within the next year. Human factor. But again, let's return to our statehood. The situation with our statehood is extremely bad. Because one of the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union, this is the vices of Marxism. That is, Marxist-Leninist philosophy, Marxist-Leninist political economy, sociology of Marxism-Leninism, and the view on the course of the global historical process and the regional historical processes that are formed by Marxism. They do not correspond to reality. Therefore, if the governance was built on the basis of false, limited and perverted meanings, then sooner or later it had to collapse. Now the system of education in the field of sociology, history, political science, economics and finance is not Marxist. It is largely borrowed from the West and is oriented on serving the liberal market economic model. We will talk about the liberal market economic model later, separately. But for now, we will simply confine ourselves to this fact. An ordinary person can hope that if he has received a good university education in the field of sociology, political science, history, economics and finance, and has come to work in the state apparatus, then his knowledge will allow him to enter professional activity and ensure the quality of governance that society wants. It would seem we have been living for 20 years after the remnants of Soviet power were liquidated, even juridically at the level of the Constitution, and we have, it seems, total freedom, democracy, rampant democratically oriented sociological and economic theories. And according to the logic of things, if all this corresponds to reality, we, but not only those 5%, should all be living well. At least those who are ready to work honestly in the social association of labor should be living well. However, the reality is such that only these very 5% are living well, while the rest have these or those claims. And now let's reason on the theme. What if Lyosha Navalny, or someone else, organizes the crowd? The Maidan from Bolotnaya will splash out and cover the country, and as a result, the Bolotnaya Maidan will nominate its statesmen. What will happen? Nothing good will happen, for the simple reason that the current governors, even if being illiterate in questions of sociology, governance and economics, they have some governorial skills, some governorial experience. Anyway, a new generation of illiterate officials and deputies will come who, on top of that, have no governorial experience. And besides, one should not forget that in revolutionary situations, when the opposition becomes more active, the feeble-mindedness that did not find a place in the previous bodies of state power usually activates. To put it differently, it will be very bad. Then the question arises, what to do? The reality is such that if, for example, you go into the House of Books in Moscow or Leningrad, you can buy all kinds of literature on the theme of sociology, political science, economics, governance. Then you can come home, honestly study all of this, not for credit, not for an exam, but in order to, after having studied all this, to become an active member of some political parties, or to become an official and make a career without abuse of power, without becoming a grabber, for whom the basis of life is the principle, took the reins, now reap the gains. But simply to serve the people. Then it turns out that on the basis of the text that you can get in the House of Books, it's impossible to gain the knowledge necessary for this. Not to be unfounded, there is a phrase, a quote from a political science textbook. The state is a concentrated expression of the idea of the political. Political. That's it. Full stop. So the political, as a phenomenon in life, objectively existing, what is this?
Ну, это такая же муть, как учебники по экономике, которые ничего не объясняют, а только больше запутывают.
Вот.
So let us anyway discuss this phrase point by point, word by word. The question immediately arises: how does the political as a phenomenon transform into the political as an idea? The state is a concentrated expression of the idea of the political.
Но есть такое стихотворение про Бармаглота. Вот это из той же...
No, the political as a phenomenon exists in life. How does this phenomenon transform into our ideas about this very political?
Да непонятно.
Further, concentrated expression. If there is the clarification concentrated, then there is a measure of concentration. How is this concentration of the expression of the idea of the political in the state measured? In chemistry, it is clear. In moles per liter, in moles per kilogram, in percent. And what about this case?
В дураках на квадратный метр. Ну, в качестве предложения.
Here again the question arises, what are we going to measure foolishness in?
Ну, там можно развить.
This is also from the same ballpark of demagogy that is in the textbook of political science. Further on, the question arises. This is one phrase. There are also many more phrases there, and more than one chapter. But if you read this textbook, then there is the same demagoguery as here in this phrase. Now let's see what they have in foreign countries. Obama has written a book. It is unlikely that he himself, most likely he signed it, and perhaps in relation to him, the question that was once asked by Sergei Yulievich Witte is fair. He was the Minister of Railways, and one of the railway magnates commissioned a group of specialists to write a book on the development of railways in Russia, which he published under his own name. And he came to Witte at the reception to hand over a copy, and was asked the question, have you read the book yourself? Obama may have written the book in the regime, have you read it yourself? Because the book is smarter in content than Obama in politics. And those tasks, about the need to solve which he wrote in his book, he, having become president, does not solve. Although he became president largely thanks to the fact that this book from 2006 to 2008 was the leader among political bestsellers. This is the Audacity of Hope, Thoughts on Reclaiming the American Dream. Obama quotes Lincoln in one of his speeches. The legitimate object of government is to do for the community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do it all, or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. Now let's compare Lincoln's statement and the phrase from the political science textbook. The difference is tangible. Why? If, for example, in the course of lectures on American political science somewhere in Stanford or Oxford, someone in lectures quotes Lincoln, then at the seminar, you can talk about problems that people, in their separate and individual capacities, cannot solve at all, or they cannot solve them well. But Lincoln said something else. You cannot help people permanently by doing for them what they could and should do for themselves. So there is a theme for another discussion. But if at seminars the state is discussed as a concentrated expression of the idea of the political, then what do we get in the end? A demagogue who can use political, scientific, and sociological vocabulary, and possession of this vocabulary for him is a kind of password, an access key for certain circles. Let's say this is a naive young man, honest, has blago intentions, who stupidly studied at the university and crammed everything. The state is a concentrated expression of the idea of the political. The financing rate must be higher than the inflation in order for the central bank not to go bankrupt, and so on and so forth. So, he comes to work in the state apparatus, or becomes a deputy of the State Duma, and he needs to solve practical questions. And in this case, we are faced with the following circumstance. In order to solve problems, in order to detect problems, governors must agree among themselves. To do this, they must master metrologically consistent theories that would describe how society generates these problems, what the interconnections between the problems are, what the recipes for solving these problems are, and who takes on what share of responsibility in these recipes, and how he coordinates his activities with everyone else. You see, if a political culture is built on the basis of Lincoln's aphorisms, that the government should solve those problems that people cannot solve on their own, and it should not do for the people what the people can do for themselves, then there are concretics here. And if there is a political culture based on demagoguery, then it is impossible to agree on the solution of problems. And this creates a general impression of the work of the state apparatus. And further, this general impression is aggravated by the fact that if we are not going to solve problems, but the possession of power opens up opportunities for us to parasitize, then parasitism does not require any knowledge, any skills of carrying out collective activities. One thing is required in this case: grab what floats by, know who should not be shorn, know who can be shorn, and carry the shorn share to the necessary one who is in the highest hierarchy of power. All of this is called corruption. The reality is such that corrupt officials do not constitute the majority among the bureaucratic and deputy corps. But in the conditions of governorial illiteracy and professional functional incapability of the majority of the bureaucratic and deputy corps, it is precisely the corruption component, against the background of the functional incapability of all the others, that creates the face of power like a party of crooks and thieves. In order for the party not to be a party of crooks and thieves, adequate knowledge, which the education system does not provide, is required. And since there is no knowledge, but there is dissatisfaction in society, the question arises, what to do with this dissatisfaction? The simplest answer to this question is which one? No, it is too difficult to organize leisure activities. The simplest answer to this question is to say that all dissatisfaction is an absence of patriotism and omnifarious political extremism. And the most reliable means of combating absence of patriotism and political extremism is the Federal List of Extremist Literature. So, over the 10 years of the existence of this list in Russia, it has become larger than the list made by the Inquisition over the course of 4 centuries. But you see, when people create a federal list of extremist literature, they anyway have to understand that in this case they themselves are the coolest extremists. For what reason? Because if you bring up the younger generation and give them such an education that after reading Mein Kampf they become Hitlerites, then you are to blame. Because you are giving them a defective education and a defective upbringing. If you do not like Mein Kampf, and at the same time you add it to the list of extremist literature, and this literature really becomes inaccessible, then wait, someone will have enough imagination that Mein Kampf will seem to you after this a collection of innocent political anecdotes. Someone will have enough imagination for this. And then what to do in order to avoid extremism? The answer here lies in the plane of the system of education. You must give the younger generations such upbringing and education that if a person reads Mein Kampf, then it's not necessary to explain to him that this is potentially dangerous for all mankind and dangerous for those who follow this, that it's a great evil. He should be surprised at how this managed to appear in a civilized society. But this is a completely different upbringing and a completely different education, because this education should answer the question: what is the norm for a person to be called a human? To put it differently, the answer to what a normal human is should be defined, meaningfully disclosed. And it must be understandable for all, and it must be confirmed by life. Well, if you ask the question, what is the norm for Western civilization?
В отношении чего?
In relation to personal development in the West, there is no concept of a norm, because in liberal culture, norms are limitless diversity, which can only be limited by the law that protects this limitless diversity. Therefore, any perversion, this is simply a manifestation of limitless diversity. Yes, they are not living in a religious culture now. Maybe there is ritualism somewhere, but ritualism and religion are two different things. Therefore, the concept of sin for them is something ephemeral, fictitious. In fact, this does not exist for them. If something is a sin, then a sin is to transgress the law. For them, breaking the enforced laws is synonymous with what used to be called sin. Now let's see. Society, some processes flow within it. These processes can be characterized in 2 words: development and degradation. What is the difference between development and degradation?
Ну, одно это образование, а другое распад.
This is not entirely true, because both formation and decay, progress, regression, These are also common words that can be filled with different content. For them, progress is the LGBT community. It is the norm. It is within the objective of fostering tolerance that boys should come to school in skirts. All school children are obliged to attend gay clubs in order to develop tolerance, and so on and so forth. Is this progress or not progress?
Это сокращение населения.
No, these are not questions of population decline. Is this progress or not progress? If there is no idea of what a normal human is, then in principle, it's impossible to answer this question. If we define the term degradation as the termination by the object or subject of its existence before the completion of a biologically predetermined cycle, then this is degradation. If an object lives through the entire predetermined for its genetic cycle, then this is development. Or development, in addition, is a progression to a certain new quality of being before the end of the life cycle or upon its completion. The difference between degradation and development is objective, and it's related to what is the norm. What is a normal human? How is this question resolved in Western philosophy? It has not been resolved in any way for several thousand years, because it's a rare textbook in philosophy that does not mention such things that Plato, or pseudo-Plato, gave the definition of man. Two-legged and without feathers. Allegedly, Diogenes plucked a rooster, presented it to Plato, and said, "Here is your man." Plato made a clarification, "and with wide nails." Diogenes did not stop there, because there is also a legend about him, saying that he walked around the city of Sinope in the daytime with a lantern, and to the bewildered questions of fellow citizens, he answered, "I am looking for a human." That is, Diogenes felt that anatomical features to characterize the taking place of a person as a human is clearly not enough. And the entire Western culture is at the level of Plato's definition, characterizing that it's enough to belong to the species of Homo sapiens and live in a human society. To what does this lead?
Ну, на самом деле, отношение западной культуры или цивилизации к, скажем так, народам другим, тем же африканцам, там, австралийским бушменам, оно совершенно другое. Они их даже за людей-то по большому счету.
And they also, by and large, don't consider us to be people either. Everyone who does not live in line with the liberal ideology, they, from their point of view, are subhuman. They must either be forcibly civilized in a Western manner or exterminated. Moreover, here is another interesting thing. In the States, a survey was conducted on the theme, "What would you do if you found out that your friend is a Homo sapiens?" 70% answered, "We would stop communicating with him." But that's not all. At Yale University, a Chinese American and another American woman did a very interesting experiment. There was a bunch of Capuchin monkeys, characterized by the words, a walking stomach, sexually horny. The psychology of Capuchins, they say, boils down to these 2 points. But I think that this is all still an exaggeration, because attempts are made to use Capuchins as house helpers for all sorts of paralyzed and seriously ill patients. That is, certain simple operations around the house, such as take, give, turn on the light, turn off the water, they understand and carry out. So these are not the stupidest monkeys, by all appearances, if this is so. Moreover, they are not aggressive. This group of monkeys was taught how to use money. That is, in order to get the money, the monkey had to pull the lever, make an effort, get some specific token, and then this token could be encashed by asking the laboratory assistant for a banana, a grape, or something else in exchange for the token. They began to change prices for labor, in the sense of pulling the lever, and for the services offered. After some time, the Capuchins got used to this money, and it turned out that they react to price dynamics in the same way as investors on the stock exchange. What if we build two gambling games? One is a losing game, and the other is a winning game. But build it in such a way that the statistical result is the same, both here and there. They prefer to play the winning game. And since the tokens are round, then, when the laboratory assistant once cut the cucumbers not into cubes, but into circles, the monkeys understood that the token was also round, and the cucumber was also cut round, and tried to use that piece of cucumber as a token in order to get what it wanted. Well, then it came to racketeering and prostitution. To put it differently, in this very monkey society, after money was introduced there, all the vices that are characteristic of the liberal bourgeois civilization manifested themselves. If we correlate with the fact that this is approximately 13,000 years after the global geophysical catastrophe that destroyed the civilization of Atlantis, then yes, the civilizational progress is obvious. It is zero, although the technosphere is developed. Let's now take a look at what is happening with us. Because among those who are dissatisfied with the way Russia lives, how does the majority relate to this? Endure and adapt. And curse the government, yes. Let off steam, emotions, or withdrawing oneself into something like football, beer, drugs, something of this kind. Those who do not accept this variant, what to do? For most of those who consider themselves active, it is to leave the country, to move to more civilized countries where the problems have been resolved. And these civilized countries include Germany, Great Britain, Canada, USA, Australia. Those who believe that the West does not live correctly, what do they want? There are two variants: Stalin, rise from the dead, or the world caliphate.
Не совсем так. Вернее, часть людей этого хочет.
And what is socialism? Confiscate and divide? This is not socialism either, because socialism anyway presupposes production. And the personification of socialism is Stalin for the majority, for the minority, Trotsky. And for those to whom atheism is not acceptable, then the caliphate is. But the reality is such that these are all the wrong answers to the questions of what to do. For what reason? We'll talk about liberal Western civilization later, but for now let's say that according to the official data of their science, over 100 years, the average Englishman has lost somewhere around 5 to 8 points of the IQ, the notorious intelligence quotient. What does it mean? This gives an answer to the question as to why the Bologna process and testing system arose. They arose because new generations were unable to master the curricula that were quite easy for their grandparents. At the same time, Western society is becoming polarized. The majority are only able to press buttons in the menu of computer programs, and a very limited minority are able to engage in high-tech, which, in principle, even monkeys can cope with. Since it all comes down to choosing menu items, and then everything else is done automatically. So the civilization is clearly degrading, despite scientific technological progress, because it all ends inevitably with the fact that someone chooses the wrong item on the menu, there appears some kind of glitch in the program. Either there is a glitch, or a genius creates a computer virus that enters the environment, and, as a result, the automation does not work as it should. That is, the prospects of this society, even in the absence of technogenic catastrophes, described by Stanislav Lem in the star diaries of Ion the Tichy, on the planet of the idiots, who gave all power of themselves to a computer machine, who decides that it's precisely idiots who interfere with putting things in order on the planet. Therefore, they are subject to total and unconditional demolition. This is something that, in principle, should be understood by those who desire to go to the West and become there a taken-place human. For those who dream of a caliphate, it is also useful to know that indeed the basis of modern science is the Arabic language terminology. Alchemy, algebra, zenith, nadir, and much more in the terminology of modern science came from the Arabic language. It came in that era when Islam was close to the Quranic Testament. And by force of this, science there developed, since in the Quranic tradition all knowledge is blago from God. The conflict between science and religion in true Islam is impossible. But after Islam decided that it was possible to live according to the Sharia, but not according to Sophist, and turned Islam into the worship of a prayer rug and ritualism 5 times a day, the development of science in the Islamic world stopped. Both modern science and the technosphere, this is the West. Therefore, the reality is such that even if the caliphate takes place, it doesn't matter, because you are hostages of those who create the technosphere, and as they manipulate you, so it will be. The ideology of the caliphate does not allow solving the problems that the West has created, which the Islamic world itself has created, having replaced Islam with the 5 times a day worship of a prayer rug. As far as socialists are concerned, socialists fall into 2 categories: national socialists and international socialists. Neither modification known in the past has proven the ability to respond to the challenges of the times and to solve the problems that they themselves, to a large extent, created. That is, if you look into the life of any of the culturally peculiar regional civilizations, liberal bourgeois, Catholic, Islamic, Vedic in India, be it Buddhist in China, or peculiar Chinese or Japanese, be it our Russian one, there are problems everywhere inherited from the past. These problems are created by the traditional mentality that has expressed itself in the activities of the people, in politics, economics, science, technology, arts. And therefore, these problems cannot be solved on the basis of everything that is in these civilizations. That is to say, alternative knowledge is required. Alternative knowledge, which must be implemented in political practice, in economic activity, in simple everyday relations, in the family, is required. And the reality is such that this knowledge in Russia is developed and expressed in Russian in the materials of the conception of social safety. In other cultures, it is not expressed. And in a number of cases, even the question of expressing this knowledge, or at least requiring it, does not arise. In our country, on the one hand it's expressed, but on the other hand, the circle of those who really seek it out, who really need it, it is rather narrow. Most either do not need it, or it causes in them skepticism and nihilism. Skepticism and nihilism are very dangerous phenomena for the simple reason that they know what they don't want. But what they want and how to realize it, this is impossible to be heard from both skeptics and nihilists, even under torture. And thus, skeptics and nihilists willingly open the way for the overthrow of the existing, and, after the overthrow is successful, they find themselves in ruins and standing before the need, if they are of course alive, to recreate something, if not from scratch, then after a great devastation.
Я вам даже возражу, обычно скептики и нигилисты ругают существующую власть, существующий строй, после того, как она падает и создается другая, как у нас было развал СССР и создание новой России, они начинают ругать новые порядки.
Not right away, but yes they do.
Поэтому обычно они сами ничего не создают, они только трепят языком и всех ругают.
This is a certain category of skeptics and nihilists. There is such, but there are those who start out as nihilists and then find themselves faced with the need to create something. And then it turns out that the culture of personal psychic activity does not allow them to create anything. At best it allows them to compile something by looking at neighbors and trying to learn from their experience. But this in fact is monkeying.
Но это тоже неплохо учесть чужой опыт, чтобы не наступить на грабли.
On the condition that the someone else's experience is functionally operable. And the reality is such that in 1991 we decided to adopt Western experience. The Japanese reacted to this in a way, "You are total fools. We are adopting your experience of the Stalin era. And our only problem is that Mitsubishi and Toshiba are competing. And you had a single state super concern, where there were no costs for the overcoming of vices of competition." This is the opinion of the Japanese. But, you know, it's a different way of adopting experience. Because experience can be adopted creatively, or it can be adopted templatively. Again, of interest. In the 1990s, there was a series about how a group of Englishmen got to Japan, to the shogun. It was around 1600. An English ship was off the coast of Japan. Everyone was in Japanese captivity. And then what next? One of the Tarango characters. Later he became a shogun. One of his characteristics, Mr. Taranago is a very intelligent person. He rarely makes mistakes. Remember Perestroika? Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, Anatoly Alexandrovich Sobchak, and so forth, the list goes on, are very intelligent people. They can talk a lot about everything without a written piece of paper.
Да, к сожалению, это так.
So, the criteria for intellectual consistency, they are different in different cultures. Now, if Mr. Taranago is a very intelligent person, he rarely makes mistakes, there will be one policy. And if Comrade Sobchak is a very intelligent person, he talks a lot without a written piece of paper, there will be a different policy with different results.
Ну, к сожалению, да.
Not unfortunately, but the reality is so. And in order that there would not be unfortunately, it is necessary to develop a certain culture of personal psychic activity. To develop adequate knowledge that allows you to solve problems inherited from the past without creating new problems. To spread this knowledge in society and build a new culture. In fact, a new civilization. On this, I think, the introductory lecture can be finished.
Да, спасибо.
You can ask questions, this is a good thing.
Вот вы сказали про 33 буквы алфавита, которые знали моряки и чуть-чуть больше. То есть, что имелось в виду чуть больше?
I was talking about the fact that the Japanese had to learn not 33 letters of the alphabet as we do, they have hieroglyphic writing, plus syllabic writing. So, anyway, they needed to learn more symbols than we learn letters. That's what I meant.
И еще вот вопрос про американцев за 80-е, когда сказали, что лодки топить атомные, то есть имеется в виду уничтожать?
Yes, destroying them. That is, if in the period of threats, they knew where our submarines were, and there was their submarine fighter on the tail of our submarines, and if their president had decided that it was time, then they would have received an order to sink our submarines.
Да, у меня, в общем-то, несколько вопросов. Но, с одной стороны, вот вы под конец сказали, что наша культура отличается от японской культуры или социологии. У нас умным считается человек, который умеет много о чем-то разглагольствовать, много о чем-то говорить. Но человек, который говорит, он не всегда может правильно управлять. Я вот просто снимаю Николая Викторовича Старикова, Евгения Федорова, депутата, других людей. Я очень часто вижу, что под роликами на Ютубе народ пишет свои сообщения и говорит: вот, Стариков молодец, он все правильно сказал, его в президенты. Вот, Федоров молодец, он все правильно сказал, его в президенты. То есть это не один раз.
Да, это много, но...
There's a lot of that. The answer to this question is this. If we proceed from the fact that such people as Christ and Muhammad were not grabbers, but they were pravyas, had a direct channel through which they could consult with the Almighty on any question, then imagine the situation that Christ comes and becomes the head of the Russian state. He is not able to replace the entire, about 18, if not more, million Governerial Corps from the level of the municipality to the level of the Prime Minister with his own personality. It takes 18 million qualified governors, brought up on the basis of the right knowledge, transformed into the right governorial skills. And besides, they all, in addition to the fact that they must be governerially literate and competent, must be humanly decent.
Вот. Большой вопрос, откуда это все взять?
Like in that song, they sing, I made him from what I had. That is, we have to engage in the transformation of what we have into what we want.
Но смотрите, какая штука. У нас существует система, в том числе система образования. Как пишутся учебники по социологии, там, политологии, вы приводили сейчас пример, да? Как вот эту систему, воспитание управленческого корпуса – это продукт воспитания этой системы, этой нравственности, этой культуры, этой социологии, этого отношения людей между собой, вот как из этого слепить других людей?
How from this to make different people? Now, in addition to this system, there is the internet. There is practically not a single student who does not use the internet. This is one side of the question. In the 1990s, the internet had just appeared. I had a conversation with a 9th grader from one of the schools. The guy's interested in how it really is. I give him a disk. And on the disk, among other things, there is an internet resource written on the disk itself, the resource where the materials of the conception are. The 9th grader looks. The first thing he sees is that internet address. Next he says, oh, this is a very well-known resource. Why is he interested in this? Because this resource is full of all kinds of information that enables him to ask teachers questions that are not answered in the standard training courses. And making the teacher an idiot is a favorite pastime of certain hooligans that are in every school, in every class.
Но, понимаете, таких единиц на самом деле.
But you know, the point is that the future is not created by the main statistical mass. The future is created by those who find themselves at the tail of the future-oriented distribution. Those who are under the hump of the statistics. They are described by the words of Kluchevsky. The regularity of historical phenomena is inversely proportional to their spirituality. If by regularity we understand the general scientific positivist, repeatability of results in the same conditions, and by spirituality we understand intellectuality and awareness, then if spirituality develops, that is, new knowledge appears, the culture of intellectual activity perfects, then history ceases to repeat itself. If spirituality does not change, culture is an inertial algorithmic system. Culture does not change.
Меняется.
What is changing? The technosphere is changing. It is, in general, the scenery. And what is the core of culture? This is nraviousness. This is ethics. But if, under the hump of distribution for 13,000 years, everything has been as with the Capuchins, then, at the entrance we send a signal, at the exit we get Maidan. Moreover, if we talk about Ukraine, this is not their first Maidan, and by all appearances, not the last Maidan. And the question is, how long can you make the same mistake? In order not to make it, one must forget what is written in the textbooks. One should look at life as it is and think. To think, this is also a term in which one can nest different meanings. To think, for one, this is to demonstrate the opinion of the authority, which he somehow learned somewhere, or got acquainted with the authority, and now retranslates it. And for another, to think. This is to understand the essence of the problems, to understand the mechanism of their generation, to understand how this mechanism can be neutralized, and how the consequences of these problems can be removed. That is, to work out some recipes. Yes, the development of these recipes can be based on the information that appeared in culture, maybe even thousands of years ago. But the result recipe, it is oriented on the concretics of our times and of the nearest future. If we talk about such thousand-year influence on our times, it should be noted that in the encyclopedic dictionaries, Socrates is characterized by the words, one of the founders of dialectics, as a method of comprehending the truth by posing leading questions. But the reality is such that everything that is said about dialectics in this phrase is all that is necessary and sufficient to learn how to use it. And everything else that is written in thick books about what dialectics is, this, in many respects, is from the devil.
Но смотрите, давайте вот более подробно разберем, более предметно. Например, сейчас у нас в обществе перекочевала с Запада мысль, что основная ценность – это деньги. Что если даже ты преступник, но ты деньги свои, но у тебя много денег, ты их даже получил преступным путем, нечестным путем, но ты все равно молодец. Деньги превыше всего. То есть даже если ты берешь взятку, как бы ты берешь деньги.
I would not say that it migrated from the West. It was exposed because it's been characteristic of our culture throughout the observable history. As for bribery, Peter I chopped heads off, and he was hardly the first to do so. And honesty was actually worth its weight in gold. Here is history. The times of Nikolai I, the squadron returns to Kronstadt from the Mediterranean Sea after many months of sailing. On the roadstead of Kronstadt, the battleship of Ferchampenois is engulfed in fire, and it burns down. The Ferchampenois is the treasury ship of the squadron. Nikolai I orders an investigation. The investigation is conducted by the future admiral Mikhail Petrovich Lazarev. He sailed together with Bellinghausen to Antarctica. Lazarev's investigation shows that the Ferchampenois burned down due to negligence. There was no malicious intent. He reports the result directly to the Tsar. The Tsar asks one simple question. So did it burn, or was it set on fire? It burnt, Your Majesty. That's it. The question is closed. That is, for Nikolai it was significant. Can you trust the person or not? He attributed Lazarev to the number of those people who could be trusted. Lazarev's investigation showed that the ship burned down. That's it. The question was closed. On the other hand, if we turn to the biography of Lazarev himself, then he characterizes Nikolai I with a single word, benefactor. Moreover, this is a person who did not acquire wealth in his service. He was really interested in the well-being of Russia, the consistency of the Russian Navy. And in his understanding, Nikolai I was a benefactor. One of the reasons for this, it boiled down to the fact that in 1835, almost the entire officer corps of the Black Sea Fleet was in debt to the usurers. When it became known to Nikolai I, Nikolai committed an act of anti-Semitism. All Jews from Sevastopol should be sent out of Crimea within 24 hours. If anyone else appears, that one has to be sent to hard labor. Destroy all promissory notes.
Да, поэтому его в истории называют жестким, там иногда самодуром.
In fact, he had no such high-handedness. He had an insufficient understanding of many questions. The palace upbringing was not entirely full-fledged. And besides, there was social inertia that he really could not overcome. Because the first documents on the theme that nobles could free their serfs was very nearly signed by Paul I, they definitely existed under Alexander. In 1844, in principle, the entire set of laws was ready for the abolition of serfdom. Nikolai, knowing the nobility, did not dare to abolish serfdom, in order to avoid noble revolt.
Ну, с этим понятно. А с тем, чтобы разобраться, смотрите, откуда мы возьмем новых людей, если общество порождает в обществе как бы...
You know, it is like a question and answer. They are also mutually connected. If society generates, if you want the result within 5 years, or at least the length of your life, then you will have one attitude towards politics and to what needs to be done. If you proceed from the fact that you are interested in a result that is guaranteedly achievable during the life of 2 to 3 generations, you will be guided by a different strategy for obtaining perhaps the same result. And the reality is such that the most precious thing we have in life is simple human communication. And the most effective thing we have in life, in terms of influencing the world around us, is also simple human communication, plus our personal culture of psychic activity. Because the reality is such that a thought, it is on the one hand information, and on the other hand, it is some kind of energy that we emit into the surrounding world. And if we emit, then there are receivers. And further, all the oscillatory systems. And the only question is there a cascade of retranslators that realize the thought or not? And what is its performance speed? If it is not the case, then is it possible to create it from nothing, or from what is around?
А можно ли в обществе это создать?
You see, social processes can be governed, including through thought.
Феномен сотой обезьяны?
I don't know if this can be described in the words, the phenomenon of the 100th monkey, or not, because the question is somewhat broader. Because it is connected with the ethics and raviousness that are really inherent for one or another applicant for governance in this way. Because if you look into history, you will find that in a number of cases, the villains were somehow unlucky in life.
Но в ряде других случаев злодеям очень везло.
Then a question about the opponents. Who were the opponents? Now, if you analyze this question, it turns out that if the villains were unlucky, then the opponents were those who strove for a previous life, Hence the words of Alexander Nevsky, God is not in power, but in truth. But when the opponents turned out to be grass on the battlefield, that is, neither a candle for God nor a poker for the devil, then yes, with the tacit approval of the indifferent in the world, the most cruel atrocities and crimes are committed. Not literally, but the meaning is such. It is analogous in Ukraine, because when for 23 years this Nazism was purpose-orientedly cultivated by all the regimes, the rest were indifferent to this. Both patriotism and social responsibility ended at the border of their own dachas or along the walls of their apartments. So sooner or later it was supposed to come to pass. Because the aphorism, if you don't engage in politics, politics will engage in you, it is historically confirmed. Again, everyone read Faust. In the school curriculum there was the following: he only earns his freedom and his life who takes them every day by storm.
Вот смотрите, на протяжении всего глобального исторического процесса выделяются три эпохи. То есть философы, социологи, деятели культуры и деятели прикладных наук различных. Выделяют три эпохи. Это эпоха премодерна, модерна и постмодерна.
I would say it like this. Firstly, this periodization is generated by Western civilization, and it characterizes its own historical experience. This is one side of the question. And the second side of the question is that this periodization falsely characterizes the historical experience of Western civilization. Something like, if you characterize my life, yesterday I wore a sweater, today I came in a shirt and a jacket, but tomorrow, if it comes to my mind, I will put on a special jacket and come in this. This is the era of the sweater, the jacket, the special jacket. Because if we talk about the essence of Western civilization, then this Yale experiment with the Capuchins summed it up. As we were monkeys 13,000 years ago, so we remain monkeys 13,000 years later. The only thing, they say, in contrast to monkeys, is changing the technospheric scenery in which all these actions take place. That's it. And if we speak in essence, the essence has not changed. Something has changed in dynamics. Because if we talk about the attributes of what existed, then it should be noted that until about the middle of the 19th century, the development of the technosphere was based on the biogenic energy of plants, the muscular strength of animals and people, plus the energy of natural elements, mainly the wind and water that turned the mill. In the middle of the 19th century, technogenic energy displaced biogenic energy from the technosphere. But this is still not a characteristic of man, but a characteristic of the circumstances that he generates and with which he interacts. There are interconnections, but the question is in the nature of these interconnections. Before the intensive introduction of technogenic energy began, the civilization could exist without limits. Because people reproduced too much, so there was either an epidemic, or they fought, there came a famine, and everything was all right. But what we have now, this is already different. because those environmental factors that generated the development of technogenic energy and the technosphere on its basis have put man before a choice, either the suicide of civilization or a change in the quality of civilization. In the conception of pre-modernity, modernity, and post-modernity, this is outside of discussion. There are no alternatives, nothing there. In fact, there are no prognostics there as such, because by default it is assumed that this limitless diversity of liberalism will solve all problems as it did in the past. It will not. Because the stability of the biosphere is possible only with the limited technogenic load on it. If civilization exceeds this threshold, goes beyond it, then the biosphere can be modified in such a way that there will be no ecological niche for Homo sapiens in the subsequent biosphere. And civilization, in the sense of the carrier of individual reason, can be some other biological species: whales, squids, cockroaches. Rats are also very smart. Depending on the state to which the biosphere will collapse, as a result of the development along the technocratic Western path. If we turn to what the philosophers of other civilizations think about periodicity, then there is a different periodicity. Our philosophers, how do they agree? You see, in Russia, there was no philosophy as such in ancient times. We had our own culture. And philosophy, why is it necessary? Philosophy, if we draw analogies, is akin to a tuning fork. No, not descriptive. It is functional. But it is functional as a tuning fork. If you have perfect pitch, why would you need a tuning fork? If you have pitch but it's not perfect, then why do you need a tuning fork? The tuning fork gives you this very la, with which everything correlates, and then the music is correct. If the music has crept away, even a semitone higher or lower, then due to the fact that a person has exactly a quarter of the wavelength of 440 Hz, La of the first octave, between the auditory receptors, then music that has gone a semitone up or down will exert a different impact. The whole orchestra goes up or down, then the music will have a different impact. It is the same with philosophy as it is with a tuning fork. Even a simple chizhik-pizhik melody is impossible to play. Philosophy itself cannot solve a single applied task. If philosophy is correct, then it's able to harmonize the interaction of all sciences and applied activities with each other. But if philosophy is false, then it is like a tuning fork. If there are several false tuning forks in one orchestra, then everything will be absolutely bad. The music will simply fall apart. Right now we live in an environment where we have a pluralism of philosophies. That is, the pluralism of tuning forks, and, accordingly, the entire orchestra of sciences goes aside and is not able to solve the problems that exist, it only creates new ones. If we talk about the philosophical culture in Russia, after philosophy came in a ready-to-use form along with Christianity, we did not have our own philosophy until, in fact, probably Pushkin and Khomyakov. We have adopted every Western philosophy. Pushkin did not express the philosophical system in strict formulas, but, nevertheless, his artistic work is a philosophical system manifested in artistic images. Khomyakov was the first to give a clear evaluation of Western philosophy, that Hegel accomplished an intellectual feat, created a philosophical system. The main merit of this system is that it cannot be used. He brought philosophy to the point where the impossibility of further development along the previous path became obvious. But Hegel did not understand this. Khomyakov understood this. But Khomyakov did not develop alternative philosophy either. The fact that the West did not understand what Hegel did was ultimately expressed in Hitlerism. Because if it had not been for Hegelianism, then there would have been no Hitlerism. Now in the West there is pluralism of philosophies. The days of philosophy in St. Petersburg are regularly held in St. Petersburg every year. Philosophers from all over Russia get together, Moscow, Leningrad. They come from the CIS countries. Few people come from far abroad. This is a philosophical get-together. One of the sections is the future of Nietzsche's philosophy. Guys, what future? He ended his life in a madhouse. But what to discuss then? Again, from Russian philosophy, Kozma Prudkov, the collective author of aphorisms. The philosopher easily triumphs over the future and past sorrows, but he is easily triumphed over by the present ones. The key to understanding this aphorism is that the present is here not only time, but it is reality. Past and future, they exist only in the imagination of the philosopher. And if the model of the world in the head of the philosopher is defective, then he does with it what he wants, and easily triumphs over both past troubles and future ones. But as soon as the present, objective reality as such, appears, if the picture of the world in the philosopher's psyche is defective, then it breaks off against this objective reality. Therefore, Western philosophy, yes, can be studied, but as a medical history.
Не, ну вот смотрите, то есть даже если брать разрыв 50 лет, то есть сравнить общество 50-летней давности, то есть даже после войны, если, и настоящее общество, то есть те моменты, которые мы имеем, то есть технологии информационного общества. Человек, он уже как социальный процесс уже видоизменились, то есть и человек, он сам поменялся. То есть совсем новое поколение получается. К чему это будет дальше вести процесс заводить?
Ну, вариантов два.
There are two variants, either self-destruction of appendages to the TV and computer for reasons beyond their control, or a change in the character of civilization, a departure from the technocratic path of development with the help of willpower, meaningful volitional order. The West is not moving yet. The East is looking at Russia. The claims of the Chinese philosophers to Russia are such that while the Soviet Union was, you were an alternative to the West. After the Soviet Union was gone, the West imagined that there was no alternative for its path. So what did you bastards do?
Очень справедливо. Но тем не менее, а как мы можем отказаться волевым усилием от техносферы, если это сразу поставит нас в военном положении ниже тех стран, у которых она больше развита? Ведь современная война...
This is not about rejecting the technosphere. It's about putting the technosphere in place. adhering to the measure. Because there are two variants. Either you are an appendage to the computer and the internet, and then you need to be taken to a psychiatrist who would do something so that you are not dependent on the internet and everything else. Or, for you, the computer and the internet are a source of operational information that you really need in order to solve real problems in life.
А телевизор?
It is almost the same with TV, because the question of the relationship with TV boils down to the following. There are statistics in real life. Real life is described by a certain set of statistics. And TV shows something. The statistics of the presentation of information on TV is such that it's very different from what is in life. And as some general said after watching a military series, I have not seen so many dead bodies in a real war. To put it differently, television lies about real facts, distorting statistics. If this is understood, then for an adult, TV is safe. For a child, TV is still a danger, because a child at a certain age perceives as patterns of behavior everything that he sees without rethinking. And the television that exists is television that programs a catastrophe. And, in fact, if Lavrenti Pavlovich wanted to talk with the leadership of television on the theme of morality, the meaning of activity, social usefulness and everything else, then 98% of television workers would not have found satisfactory answers to the questions that Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria may have asked them.
Ну, это просто работа.
It's not about whether it's work or not. The thing is that now a television journalist, a talk show host, or a host of something else, basically does what in ancient times only the higher Jretsud could do. Utter all sorts of words addressed to the whole people. When the higher Jretsud was engaged in this, then before becoming the higher Jretsud, it mastered several professions at the level of high professionalism, knew a lot of things, had certain views for the future, and uttered all sorts of words, relying on what it knew and what it could do, orienting towards a certain future. Now the student has a few scores in the unified state exam, then he enters the journalism faculty and graduates from it. And that's it. If he is promoted to any federal channel, after a few years we see his bright face and he chats about anything.
Он болтает то, что нужно.
This is not what I'm talking about. He chats about anything that pleases the one who promoted him there. Moreover, he himself does not think about it. Well, it can also be interesting to see with what aplomb journalists talk about what they really have no knowledge and understanding about. And if you look at things from the other side, everything related to journalism, then any intellectually normal person should be able to tell in his own words what he sees. If we talk about the principles of composition of frames for photography and filming, everything can be told within about an hour. Everything else is the art of pressing the button in time. That is, the reality is such that 5 years at the Faculty of Journalism is too long. In real life, there is not so much material for a 5-year course. Yes, there are features of the organization, of the editorial office, preparation and everything else. But this is not a university education, and not for 5 years. That is to say, the reality is such that if we really talk about training a corps of highly professional journalists who would be useful for the people, then journalism education can only be the second higher education, but not the first one. And before starting this, a person must work somewhere, become a professional somewhere, try himself as an amateur journalist somewhere, and only after that, yes, it's better to become a parent. And only after that does the question of professional journalistic activity arise. We have turned everything upside down. The reality is that among those who receive a journalism education, after 10 to 15 years, only a few become journalists, worthy of the respect of society and who are useful to society. But anyway, gaps in education make themselves known.
Можно у меня вопрос про дробление власти в истории? Вот раньше были бояре во времена Ивана Грозного. Как бы управленческий корпус был маленький, а людей, которым управляли, много было. На каждого чиновника очень много людей. Потом, где-то времена Петра Первого взять уже дворянство. То есть чиновников уже больше, и у каждого из них народу во власти меньше. Ну, вот эти. Потом в Советском Союзе уже чиновников очень много, и получается там на 10 человек граждан один чиновник. А в будущем, наверное, просто получится, что каждый человек сам себе чиновник будет. Вот что в историческом процессе обуславливает вот этот процесс дробления?
First of all, the loss of governorial professionalism by officials. It happened all over the world. And this is precisely the loss of governorial professionalism. Because if we turn to the history of ancient Rus, in pre-Rurik times, the border of the past era and the current one, then governance was based on different principles. There was Žrec power. What were these guys doing? Analysis of problems, analysis of prospects, working out of recipes for solutions. Further, the Prince-Boyar world. What did this class do? They, in fact, took responsibility for what the Žrecs told them, and implemented those projects that were worked out by the Žrecshood. Moreover, if we correlate with the entire function of governance, then Žrec power is the highest intrasocial power. And in Rus, it was accessible to everyone. In other words, no matter what family you were born into, if you were able to master the knowledge and skills that allowed you to enter Žrec power, then no claims towards you. Yes, there was such a saying, from rags to riches. By what was it caused? It was caused by the fact that the system of education was localized in the family. And if one father taught his son to be a farmer, and the other taught his son to be an administrator, a military leader, then there was practically no interchangeability. But there were no nravious ethical differences between the Žrecshood, princes, boyars, and ordinary people. In such conditions, the abuse of power was impossible. Because if society is ethically homogeneous, then everyone is interested in one thing. Do I trust you as a governor with solving this problem? Yes, I do. If I trust, I don't care what decisions you make, to whom and what you entrust. The task must be solved. But by virtue of the inravious ethical unity of society, no one will remain offended if the task is solved successfully. Therefore, everything was oriented on solving the task. There were minimum laws, but there was total freedom of creativity. Many governors were not needed in such conditions. Further, the society is ethically not homogeneous. We steer, we have the right. You do not steer. You are under us, you have no right. One cannot steer everyone. The construction of a governorial hierarchy begins. Since the society is ethically heterogeneous, there arises the question of deception. To avoid deception, it is necessary to clearly define the functions of everyone. Legislation appears, job responsibilities appear, clearly spelled out in job descriptions. Going beyond the job description is a crime. But it's almost impossible to spell out everything. This is one of the regularities of cybernetics, that the system cannot contain all the information that is necessary for its complete description. And then there begins the multiplication of governorial positions with the fragmentation of their responsibilities. Further, this leads to the fact that they begin to invent a lot, both for themselves and for subordinates. They break away from the endeavor, and everything goes wrong. This is the path followed by Western civilization, having inherited this tradition from ancient Rome. With us, the attitude towards legislation is mostly disregarding. We don't care about it. This stems from two things: the stupidity and unpreviousness of the majority of laws, and the second is the feeling that really the system is ineffective, and lawless governance is more effective, because it delves into the concretics. But lawless governance can be effective and functionally operable only under conditions of nravious ethical unity of society, which now is absent. And in conditions of the tribal system, this is impossible.